Before we get into the text and to talking about the various kings of both the northern and southern kingdom, let's bow our heads together in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we share together in study and the safety you give our families. Help us as listeners and students of the Scriptures to be considerate to the intent of the message, to be careful in our reading of the Scriptures, and to be patient in our growth of understanding. Help us as disciples to mature our faith, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so as we mentioned last week as well, we've got quite a bit of the sequence of the kings to pay attention to. Obviously, we've already covered the United Kingdom kings really quickly, and now we're in the various sections of the divided kingdom. I'll forecast for the future a little bit here. Once we conclude the series of these kings as an overview, we'll have a brief interlude where we're going to talk about the timeline of events that constitute everything from the United Kingdom to the return, to what would be the close of the minor prophets work. We'll also then have a small section on what is referred to as the intertestamental period, if you're talking about a technical term. But more practically, it's just from the close of the minor prophets to the arrival of the Gospels or John as our next prophet. And it's in that time frame where we have to pay attention to two things. It's kind of setting you up for what's next. Number one is that there is not a substantial amount of biblical accounts in that time frame. It is discussed. They discuss it from the prophetic side, looking forward, and you can also see in the Gospels they look backward and they talk about that time frame. But that means then we have our other sources we have to pay attention to. We can go into what we consider secular history, that's non-biblical text history, and pay attention to the origin of a few things that will shape the world of Jesus. These are some of the major historical events that will shape the Israelite content and culture for the arrival of Jesus. And so we'll pay attention to a few of those because they're significant in creating the environment that Jesus is going to enter into. So then, inching backward, we will be talking about these things in sequence. Because as soon as we finish, obviously, our survey of the Old Testament history, we'll start talking about the history and geography of the New Testament side of things. Some of it will seem like a repeat, but obviously then we'll be moving off of Israel eventually and into that greater world that Paul explores geographically. All right, so narrowing back in. You should have gotten a message, an update if you're following the emails that talk about the next level of connections in the text. That is, we're also making sure to be aware, and we've been doing this in our class discussions, of the prophets who are involved. We have our kings, and we can often go through and link down the various kings and say this one, this one, this one. We can also go through and note that some of the prophets are appearing there. In the list that went out on Saturday, it also included some of the major physical places where some of the key events took place, and so there's some of that information. By the way, did anyone remember to do their homework from last week? And find those songs that the kids sing from how to align these kings in order? People are smiling. Anyone want to sing a song for us? They were like, nope, 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 nope. That's fine. See who's bold and wants to give it a try. Here's what's going to happen. In a few weeks after we finish this, even after we go through our timeline, we're probably going to try to do a memory task where we can think through it. And you'll get an email that gets sent home to you. You won't have to sing it in front of everybody. No one's going to be paraded up in front of the microphone to sing their song. Don't get nervous. But I'm trying to give you tools that use different methodologies to remember this. Because remember, we talked at the beginning of the class, we all have different ways that we learn. Some of us need visual reinforcement, pictures. Some of us need rigor, reminders, the same thing over and over again. And all the rest of us kind of fit in the middle of those two things. And so having those other tools are designed to take all this information and make it more accessible at the top of our memories. And try to kind of, again, reorganize the way we think about things. So Omri comes in. This is Israel. This is obviously we can think about when we say Israel in this case, we can know the content generally of the quality of king that we're talking about. Omri overcame his rival Tibni pretty quickly. The kingdom itself, but the king is identified as making the purchase, bought a hill from Shimar and built the capital city of Samaria. There's not much said about Omri in the Bible other than he is a powerful political individual. And for the next 100 years, Israel is referred to as the house of Omri when we go outside the land of Israel. So his prominence is so substantial that when people start talking about Israel on the outside, they are talking less about the house of David, which is how these kingly groups are put together, and more about the house of Omri. Omri is going to then produce a couple of shifts in the Israelite space, one of them being the arrival of Ahab. Ahab might be, in the literary sense, an illustration of the worst, right? There's a couple of different ways that kings are referred to. I think at this point we could easily say that this is our most wicked king. And again, what's our metric for determining the morality of a king? Remember this when we were studying the kings, when we went through the books? What do we want the kings to do?
The years that they reign, is that what you're talking about?
The years is part of it. So do they get that 40? That's always a good plus. What's another thing that tells us good king, bad king? How the father structure is used. Do they go to their fathers or do they not? Rich, what'd you have?
What do they tear down the idols or not?
The idols, yeah. Do they leave the high places? Do they leave the idols in place? Or do they tear those down? These are all in part related to the covenant commitment that they had made as being part of God's people. And if they are keeping the covenant, they want to tear down those idols. And sequentially they'll go higher and higher into the mountains to tear them down. If they are not going to keep the covenant, then they will go lower and lower in the land to build idols closer and closer to the people of Israel. And so you can use that as like a visual thought process to say what's going on there. Because the covenant, again, is designed to keep the land holy, Israel holy, and the relationship holy. And so they are going to keep it or not keep it. And when this separation takes place, the prophets of God brought a message to the first king of the separated nations and said, hey, if you keep the covenant, you will still have blessings. And they failed to do so. So the covenant, the general covenant, is independent, then we can think about this, of the various royal lines. There's a royal covenant with David that brings out Jesus, but independent is the covenant that Israel has. That's separate from the Davidic kingly context. Even more so with Ahab, we are encountering Jezebel. Jezebel is so substantially significant that her name jumps from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, reappears in the Christian Bible, in the text of Revelation and other places, and to this day. In American culture, we still think of Jezebel as being a name you would never want to assign to anyone in your family, right? Every now and then you find somebody who's not familiar with the Bible who names their kid Jezebel. Like, it still happens. I often wonder if maybe they are familiar with the Bible. I don't know. But it still happens, right? But that's like one of those names like, okay, we just can't use it. Like, no matter how it sounds to you, you're not going to do it. Because instantly, without hesitation, especially in American culture, we know what that word should latch on to. In the context of Israel, what this does is two things. Number one, It aligns Israel, not Judah, but Israel, with Phoenicia. And so it's a common contract marriage in that regard, where it binds these two nations together, opposite of what Israel did when they came to take the land. When they came to take the land, the statements were made, hey, come marry in with us. You take our daughters in marriage, we will take your daughters in marriage, and we will be one people. And so this is a kind of counteraction to that, similar to what Solomon does in his role as king. And for Israel, now it shifts one more step, where not only do you have an awful king who's not fighting against idolatry, you have an awful king who is establishing idolatry as the de facto religion of this people. This sets the stage for what would be the eventual destruction of Israel. This is the absolute worst of the worst behavior in the thinking through of how this plays out. In context, then, that also puts us into thinking about Elijah, Elisha, and Micaiah. So you have very powerful prophets who are engaged in that. All the stories you start thinking about, whether it is the conquest at Mount Carmel, whether it is people coming back from the dead, these are all things that occur in contrast to this set of kings and leaderships. It doesn't mean that now that because they're united to these other nations that there's no outer forces at play. They have to fight against Ben-Hadad of Syria. And then the Assyrian records tell us of the battle at Karkar on the Oronantes River with Ahab and Ben-Hadad as part of the opposition coalition. So you have external references to these events taking place. So we have now Ahab coming in with his 22-year reign, but it's incredibly significant because not only do we have the idolatry coming in, which is going to sully the souls, then the land's consequences start rising up. Remember how I've talked about how Israel is very dependent on the rain for its food sources? 3-year drought. So in that area, there's no rain, there's no food. You have a repeat of earlier historical events when they had to flee the area because they simply couldn't live. There's just not enough regular spring-fed water to provide food for the Israelites in that area, and so they're punished. This is a indicated direct outcome of their spiritual rebellion. The Syrians besiege Samaria, and they are defeated. Attack again at Aphek, and are defeated again. Ahab is going to take Naboth's vineyard in this time frame. And Micaiah prophesies Ahab's death, and Ahab is then slain in battle. So you have this full cycle of events as Israel is trending down and down, morally, then physically, affecting not only the royalty, but eventually all the common Israelites, even those who would have been considered faithful. They're all swept up in these captivities. There's going to be a series of captivity moments where in 3 cycles you're going to see Israel gobbled up and then Judah gobbled up into captivity. And then when the return is talked about, you actually see them returning 3 times. So you have 3 steps down and 3 steps back. And we'll see all of that take place. Again, you saw our same prophets. You have, again, the Mount Carmel incident. Elijah is going to flee from Queen Jezebel to Beersheba. Remember, Dan to Beersheba is a way to think about the scope of these lands. And later he will anoint Elisha as his recipient of his role. Remember, this is also one of those challenging things in the Bible when you're reading through to be able to slow down and properly pronounce the 2 prophets. Because when you're reading the Bible aloud, it's really easy to mispronounce Elijah and Elisha. So this is like a little tip to say, if you slow down and read more carefully, you'll actually pronounce those names properly. This is from my perspective, because this is what I do sometimes when I don't slow down. but it also helps you pay attention to the details. So slowing down isn't just about speaking properly. It's paying attention to what's going on and seeing the details. All right, so that's our king on that side. We shift over to this side. We've got Jehoshaphat, who's serving at this time as the leader for Judah. Judah is still clinging to the covenant in many ways. Neither of these two kingdoms, by the way, are uniform in that just because a chunk of them go bad, it doesn't mean that all of them are bad. And just because a chunk of them are good, it doesn't mean all of them are good. But that does pull the string in either directions. So you have a bad king, all of Israel gets pulled this way. If you have a good king, all of Judah gets pulled back closer to God. And Jehoshaphat certainly would be one that we would consider pulling people back to God. Not perfect, but certainly moving more in the correct direction, such as appointing teachers to teach the law. Kind of important if you've got a covenant to know what the rules are. How many of you live in HOAs right now? You know, like your property is an HOA. When you bought your house, did they give you a rule book as to what the HOA rules were? How many of you read the rule book? Some of you did, right? Some of you did not. I did not initially read the rule book. I read the sections that I thought applied to me. More particularly, I missed the section regarding boats in the driveway and how long they can be there. And it's not very long, by the way, at least in our HOA. And so knowing the rules help you understand what you're allowed to do. And by the way, even if you don't live in an HOA, does our county have rules? Yeah. The most easy one to not be careful about is the burn rules that are for the state and the county as to when you can have a burn pile in your yard and you can't. And that's a big risk. There's reasons for the rules. And so you think about that, hey, we're accustomed to that. Well, Israel had reached a point where nobody really knew what God wanted of them. And I see Israel now, speaking more specifically of Judah. And not knowing what the rules were, that's a big deal. Because you're going to have a cultural awareness of God. Oh, we follow God. But you will not have a specific ability to know what God wants you to do and how to do it. Imagine right now trying to cook a meal using modern technology, but all you have is how your great-great-grandma told you how to cook it over like a letter or something. And you don't have the same tools. She may have cooked it in a wood-fired stove or over an open flame, and you're trying to do so in a toaster oven. You will not be successful because you don't have the standards. It will be a bad experience for everybody, right? Well, that's kind of what happens when you have a moral context where everybody, well, we follow God and we know what he wants us to do because great-grandma told me. Well, between you and great-grandma, you probably forgot some important things. You probably picked up some stuff. So this choice to appoint teachers then starts changing the world around them. He even received tribute from the Philistines and the Arabians. And then there's also some weird things that take place. He aligns himself with Ahab in regards to an attempt to recover Ramoth Gilead from the Syrians. He's rebuked for that alliance, even though it was practical. Moab, Ammon, and the Mennonites rebel against Judah. And then he joins forces with Jeroboam to subdue Mesha, one of the initial forces and kings that come in. He's dealing with two different prophets, Jehu and Eleazar. So they come in as prophets for the kingdom of Judah, serving in contemporary time frames with other more notable major prophets as well. And you're seeing someone, because remember, he's a good king, but he's not a perfect king. He's rebuked. His behavior to align with a rebellious nation who is idolatry is destroying the land is certainly a substantial challenge and problem. So this is that counterpart. So these are basically the contemporaries for the time of Ahab. Jezreel is Jehoshaphat. That brings us to the following kingdom. Another short one here is Ahaziah. Now follows after Baal. or Baal. Those are the two English pronunciations for that Hebrew phrase or Akkadian phrase. And Jeroboam's golden calves. Point to recognize is this is a circling back moment. Because if you go back to the entrance for Israel, this is the kind of thing that they brought with them and they were trying to expel. But because of their choices, they never left behind and they never truly got rid of it. In the archaeological evidence of this region, you can see that these things never truly vanished from the land. There's always incidences when you dig through their history and say, well, here you go, this is a time period where you had a good king, but you also still had people following the false gods, following and worshiping the idols in the various cities, even up to at times to a high degree, where they are now established religions like you're seeing here. Moab is in the same time frame rebelling against Israel. He'll join forces with Jehoshaphat to have a small navy at Ezion-Geber. He is going to be reproved, that's Jehoshaphat, for that choice. And Ahaziah is going to fall and eventually die. Prophets here are still ongoing with our two major prophets. His enemies are going to be Mesha of Moab. And the Moabite stone is one of our archaeological pinpoints. It tells of Mesha's victories over both Israel and Judah, and describes the power of his nation at that time as he sees it. And I think toward the end of this, we'll have a quick reminder of some of those historical tidbits. We've shown them before in other places, and so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on those right now. Jehoram comes in for Israel, son of Ahab, brother of Uzziah. He has conflicts with Syria. Samaria is again besieged in this time to the point that they're starving. Remember, this is a consequence of both conflict and covenant problems. Jehoram is wounded in battle, but eventually he is murdered by his own people. Very standard outcome for, in particular, the kings of Israel, but also historically the same thing takes place. This is where Elisha really becomes the center prophet. Sometime around this reign is where Elijah is no longer on the scene. In the historical readings, you get a lot of the stories that revolve more about Elisha and Elijah than the kings, because they're the ones who are more actively serving God. Naaman's story takes place around this time as well. And so you're thinking about what's occurring here. Back in Judah, our southern kingdom, we've got Jehoram, who serves for 8 years. He's not a great king. Our 40-year metric certainly comes into play. But his first behavior, kill off all his brothers. That's usually not a great sign for the quality of king that you have if he's worried about family coming in and dethroning him. He marries Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. That's a second tip-off of the quality of his character. In this time frame, Edom revolts against Judah. It's attacked also by the Philistines, the Arabs, and this all taking place near the area on the southern part of things. All of them took part except, they took all that he had except Jehoahaz and Athaliah. Prophets start showing up in addition to that. Obadiah is a contemporary to this rule. On the other end of the table, we have Ahaziah again, another one in Judah. So 1 year reign of a very wicked king as well. Goes to visit Jehoram in Jezreel, where he is recovering from his wounds. In this time frame, Jehu is appointed as king in Ramoth Gilead, and hurries to Jezreel, where he kills both kings. That's going to take place here in just above Beth Shean, or where the Kishon River comes in. If you're thinking at your big map there, you can kind of see where Megiddo is up here and Samaria is down there. Up to our right on the map where the blue field is where Dan would be on the top sections of it. All right, so that is our first chunk of kings. We're going to go ahead right now and quickly lay this out. Okay. You were faster when I planned you at home. Let's go. All right, this is the next about 100-ish years of rule for the kings. You're going to see some things quite obviously in our kind of approximation. You'll notice that Israel does not have a great shifting in kings. They're basically going to be mostly bad to some degree or another. Our southern kingdom, or Judah, has its ups and downs. We think about what's going on from Athaliah to Hezekiah. Hezekiah is generally received as being a pretty good king, where Ahaz and Athaliah are generally seen as being some of the worst kings. As is the case, there's a gray space in the middle, where they're better than worse. And that's recognized in another way. We've talked about our first couple metrics of how you can determine a good king, bad king. High places, their length of reign, their general disposition towards God. The next layer is kind of obvious. Does God bring judgment to them? In the sense of, does he actively seek to either end their rule or bring Israel or Judah into captivity? And Hezekiah is a great illustration of this, where that needle shifts a little bit as to when that takes place. And so as long as God is forbearing, it's a sense there is still hope. Whereas the northern kingdom, Israel, it falls first into bondage and into captivity because of its consecutive and consistent immoral rule. Paying attention to those, we're going to go a little bit quicker over these smaller kingships than we did the first section. And so you're going to see me kind of, not so much scoot through them, but try to pay attention to some of the more important details. Athaliah is our king in Judah. This is an outlier in that it is not part of the Davidic line. It's a usurper. That's important because we're trying to pay attention to those two tendrils, covenant side and then Davidic side. This is the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Killed all of her grandsons. Remember, we talked about this before in other contexts as well. Jehu came in, the Israelite King Jehu, in this time frame, ruthlessly killed Jezebel, fulfilling that prophecy of Elijah. We talked about that at the close, where he's rushing to do that. And also killed all of Ahab's family's relatives and officials, killed the Baal worshippers. He had the opportunity to turn Israel back to Jehovah. Instead, he turned to Jeroboam's golden calves. And God's response is the outcome. Israel began to lose much of its territory. It began to shrink in its power. This is Elisha as our primary prophet of the time frame. Brings us to Joash. This is now Judah. Joash fulfills our first criteria, right? 40 years. Good hint that maybe you got a pretty good king here. With Jehoiada in this same context, the Baal temple is destroyed, the temple of the Lord is repaired. But when Jehoiada, the priest, dies, Joash abandons worship of the temple, turns to idols, rebuked by Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, has Zechariah killed, takes the treasures from the temple to pay off Hazael to not face Jerusalem, and then he is also murdered. If you're looking for prophets, you've got Joel and obviously Zechariah. In conflict constantly with Hazael, and his son Ben-Hadad is then made king of Syria in this time frame. Jehoahaz is king of Israel on the other side of the table, 17 years, short reign, also worshipped Jeroboam's calves. And so those calves end up becoming the central space of worship for the Israelite people in absence of Jehovah. He prayed for help. God promises to send Israel a savior in that time frame. And the prophet in the space is Elisha. Thinking about the geography of the area, you can start to see some major shifts. You'll note that the power of Israel and the power of Judah is much smaller at this point. If you go back and think to David and then Solomon, they were all the way up to what would even now be in the sense of thinking about its there it is. So this whole region, even like the Sea of Galilee, which is a notable spot for the New Testament side, all the way up to the edge of Dan would have been the typical northern edge, the Farquhar. Up here would have been Israel at its power base, at its biggest power space, all the way down to this lower section here, just over the Dead Sea. There would have been the power of Israel. But because of their failure to keep the covenant, the power rising in the other nations around them, and God's judgment, you're seeing them shrink substantially at this point in time. Joash is now our next king in Israel, reigns for 16 years. He also, catch it, worshipped Jeroboam's calves. You'll notice that that is one of the repeating phrases there. Still has a number of kingly activities that interact with the prophet Elijah, but clearly a wicked king. Even though at times he is successful in gaining more land, it's not a dramatic change. In Judah, we have King Amaziah, 29 years of reign. He's as good as Joash at the start, but he increasingly became more wicked. He was able to subdue Edom and capture Selah. He executed the servants who murdered his father. He fought against Jehoash at Beth Shemesh, but he was defeated and eventually was killed in a conspiracy by his own people. Again, a repeat behavior. In this case, it's in Judah. Over on the other side, you have what we call Jeroboam II. It's the second one. It's not actually listed in second in your Bible. We have to designate him separately some way or another. 41 years. This is a period of time when Jehovah delivers Israel. He restores Israel's border from the entrance to Hamath to the Sea of the Arabah, that's the Dead Sea. The people and the king continued, though, in full-fledged apostasy from God. So though they are blessed because of the promise God made, they themselves don't turn back. He even recovers Damascus and Hamath. Prophets in this era, Amos, Hosea, and Jonah. This is when Jonah is sent to Nineveh, and you have the whole interlude that takes place there. We've also then got Uzziah, who's a king for Judah, 52 years, an extended rule. A good king with a good priestly component in Zechariah the prophet, serving on the other end of that spectrum. Warred against the Philippines, broke the walls of Gath, Jabesh, and Ashdod, fortified the walls of Jerusalem. His army was substantial. It's a time of prosperity. But the people's service to God was in word only, lip service. He would then be stricken with leprosy. Prophets would be Zechariah and Isaiah. He was the advisor to the kings of Judah at this point in time. You can kind of see some of this as you compare now a second time frame versus the empire in David and Solomon versus now where the kingdoms sit. So Israel's strength had returned. Judah's power had reached a new reach as well. But it is still not what it once was. We still don't have the full might of a united people. Zechariah comes in as our king. This is Israel's Zechariah. Wicked king, golden calves of Jeroboam are still in place. He's the fourth descendant of Jehu to reign. He is then killed by Shalom. In particular, he's murdered by his own people. Prophet Hosea is there at that time. Shalom follows in afterwards. Shalom has a shallow rule. That's 1 month. That's in 2 Kings 15. Another wicked king who is murdered by his own people. It's almost like you're seeing a trend there. Menahem rules for 10 years. Not only wicked, but he's also very cruel. And that cruelty is even seen in how he treats the least capable of actually defending themselves. And is just about as awful as you're going to find in that area of cruelty toward his own people. Israel is invaded by Pul, king of Assyria, and forced to pay what would be an enormous tribute at that time, while Hosea is the prophet. Pul of Assyria eventually would take the title of Tilgath-Pileser III. It's one of the official titles, kind of like you have Caesar's. And he takes that title and becomes a noteworthy king that is substantially influential in the region. Pekaniah becomes king of Israel at this point. He's serving as 2 years. He's one of his sons of Menahem. He is slain by Pekah, his captain, again murdered by his own people. This is when Hosea would utter, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge." Pekah, who had killed his father to take up the role, is now our new king for 20 years. Very wicked himself. You could start seeing the trend. Worshipped Jeroboam's golden calves. This kind of helps to define our understanding of Israel as it separates from Judah at this point in time. Makes alliances with nations around him. You still have Hosea as a prophet, but you also get Oded, who shows up in the text. And now Pul, who is known as Tilgath-Pileser, invades Syria, Israel, Phoenicia, and Philistia, basically encroaching throughout the entire region incrementally, taking power over everything. Jotham, who is king in Judah, is identified as doing what is right in the sight of God, but the people are corrupt. He will eventually be subjugating the Amorites, and prophets Isaiah and Micah are active in Judah at this time. Ahaz, another one, comes up into Judah. Terribly wicked king, brings the Baal worships or Baal worshippers into Israel and to Judah in particular. He is the one who burned his own children in the fire to Molech, if you remember that part of the awful history of Judah. He was invaded by Edom and the Philistines, sent to the king of Assyria to help. So he asked for an even more wicked person to help him, and began worshiping the gods of Syria in the end. Isaiah and Micah now are our prophets in that space. Then we have Hoshea, who comes as king as Israel. Obviously another wicked king. Rebelled against Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, who would have been his lord, and Hoshea should have been a vassal to that. The Sumerians are besieged by the Assyrians. Foreigners are brought in from Babylon and other places. They're mixed with the poor left in the land. And the land stopped being called Israel at this point and started being called Samaria. And so all of that land that once was called Israel, or the northern kingdom, historically now is generally referred to as Samaria. By the way, that's also what we think about when Jesus is interacting with the Samaritans as the same people. And some of Jesus' preaching took place on the edge of that Samaritan region. Hoshea is engaged in that role when Hosea is still prophet. Primary enemies, So of Egypt, that's one of the pharaohs or kings, Shalmaneser of Assyria. That siege would be finished by Sargon II. And Israel as a kingdom is done. There's a tremendous amount of historical and archaeological evidence that connects to the crushing of Israel that's found in museums across the globe. And so this is a pretty obvious end to Israel that's accounted both in the biblical text and in history. Judah comes in as our remaining king at this point, our kingdom at this point. Hezekiah is our first major king that we're going to talk about. Last one for today, though. Reigns 29 years. His reign is chronicled for us both in Kings and the book of Chronicles. And is overall a good king. Destroyed the idols, trusted the Lord, cleansed the temple, restored the daily sacrifices in the temple, made the effort to restore daily spiritual life in the Judean kingdom. He even had the great Passover feast that was observed with those from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun attending. And so for our point, we at least get to close out this morning as we're reviewing all these kings on somewhat of a high mark. And so you have all that Samaritan region now has gone into captivity. And everyone that's left there is of mixed descent because the method of conquest was to move populations around to disrupt their cultural connections. And so the Samaritan people now are heavily intermingled with all the other areas' peoples. Which leads us to be able to ask and bring back out of the Dark Ages our questions, such as, what did you like or not like about surveying all those kings? Either question's answer is fine. If you want to talk about what you didn't like, that's a good answer. And if you want to talk about what you liked, that was good.
Not a whole lot I found to like.
Not a lot to like.
You went through it pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah.
I appreciate what you had to do. But my attention span was trying to keep up with you.
Oh, no, I'm with you right there. And the reason we went through it quickly is we're going to go back through it as well in a couple different areas, but is to pay attention to this part of it. What Les caught on to, these evil kings, that none of them learned their lesson. They repeated the behavior that had the same outcome. But here's the thing, even when a good king rose up, very often the next king didn't remember why that guy had a good reign. There seems to be this disconnect from the current, whatever's going on and what they want to do. We have to remember that these are actually people whose their desires often outweigh what we think is rational behavior. Because just as it was for people in the first century who did not know who Jesus was going to be like, everyone living these stories didn't have the advantage of the entire Bible to go back and say, hey, you know what? I've noticed a trend that if we actually keep the covenant, God blesses us. They are all having to develop their own faith. And like you and I, it is rarely an easy process where it's like, oh, I've just got it all figured out today, and today's a great day, and every day after that's perfect. Because even those kings we identify as good kings, their faith was challenged. Many of them did a lot of good stuff, but some of their choices were not good at all. And they had to deal with the consequences of those good things. And so seeing them quickly kind of compresses those facts down. And remember, if we had just sat down and read this portion of the text over the last 3 weeks that we've been reviewing this, the 3 or so hours we've used is about how long it would take most of us to read through most of it. So we're kind of covering it almost at the same pace as you would if you're just reading the text. What we're doing, though, is also making sure we're tying in the details, making some extra connections. Our clock says we're going to have to be done right now, so we're going to follow the clock. But next week we'll have our last chunk of Kings. That'll be next week. We're going to rush through those using Donna's accurate statement that we are going to rush. But that's because we're going to come back and afford some other time to it in other ways, too. Thanks, everybody.